Hello, and welcome to Weekend Wisdom here on Nightlight Astrology, you guys. I am Alexandra Blair. I am being joined today by my lovely co hosts on this very program, Whitney Kranz and Alex Amorosi. And we are here today to talk all things dignity and debility in spooky Scorpio. We're ready to piss off some Scorpios. Are you guys ready?
Like it's hard. It's a quote Elle Woods. Like it's hard.
It's been hard. No, it's not. It's not that hard. What are your guys? Let's go around each week. Or every month when we do this dignity talk, we talk about our Scorpio credentials. My credentials. I have my MC conjunct Pluto in Scorpio, so that's why I look like this, I guess. Yes. What are your guys' Scorpio credentials? How do you feel?
I have Uranus in Scorpio. It doesn't do a whole lot by hard aspects in my chart, but I definitely have a fascination with Scorpio, and I've been so excited to have this conversation. So I'm super psyched.
And it probably activates by transits too.
It does, and I'm just finished up my Uranus return, which was a really interesting process over a couple of years. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. We'll have to hear a little bit more about that as we dig in here. Not a whole lot in Scorpio, only Pluto, like all the other millennials out there. I'm quite the fixed girl, as a Leo rising, though. So,
also activated by transits, yeah.
Yes. So Scorpio is my fourth house, and certainly feel it.
Absolutely. We're actually going to talk about Mars today. We're going to talk about Pluto and Scorpio as well. We're going to talk about Venus, and we're going to talk about the moon. First, I want to point you guys to the Nightlight Astrology website. Adam is currently enrolling for his first year astrology certification course. The next cohort begins on November 15th, and early bird payment is available. Tuition assistance is available. We often sing the praises of this curriculum, but as recently as last year, I enrolled in and took the first year curriculum as a professional astrologer. I found so much valuable information. Adam really is a very special and very gifted teacher, and studying with him is such an awesome privilege that everyone deserves to invest in. So make your way over there and check that out. Adam and the Nightlight crew are also hosting an immersive retreat next summer in Mexico from June 6th through 13th, 2026. It's called The Oracle Within. They are going to be previewing some of their new curriculum and doing a lot of like divinatory development and astrological seminars. And it looks like it's going to be a really, really gorgeous experience. So definitely check that out too over there. Okay, now on to the show. We are here to talk about Scorpio dignities, all things Scorpio. We are going to talk about how planets do and don't function and how they are equipped or in or out of context in Scorpio. For the past few months, we have talked about what it means when a planet is in dignity or debility or peril, detriment, fall. We can use all of these words, and we will today. But Alex Amorosi always shares with us his lovely analogy that I think is one of the best analogies for planetary dignity. Alex, you want to trot that out for us again, just in case anyone is tuning in for the first time?
That was the best intro for a Leo rising you could ever give. Your brilliant, incredible, one-of-a-kind, perfect way. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Peerless, in fact.
I was actually thinking about this morning. So, just doing my errands and stuff. When a planet is in its domicile, it's like your home in your hometown or close to around where you are, where you don't have to think. You don't have to expend a lot of energy on where you are and what you're doing and where you're going. You know where you're going. You know where the grocery store is. You are speaking the language of that culture. You were just in a place that feels very, very familiar. Kind of like that no place like home type of feeling. When a planet is in exile or fall, it's a little bit like that planet is in a foreign country. It doesn't speak or read the language. It doesn't really understand the culture. And so it has to sort of learn how to adapt itself to that culture, and doesn't have the facility of ease that it would when it's just in its normal home space. But through that process, there's a lot of learning and a lot of growth that happens. And, you may never actually be, if you're not born in a certain place, it can feel very difficult to say, I'm of that place. But you can learn how to be there. And you can learn the language, and you can learn the idiosyncrasies of the culture, and you can learn the little stuff that, would probably throw you off when you first got there. And it can be an extraordinarily enriching and really valuable experience. So again, I think it just bears repeating because we say this all the time. When you have a planet in fall, like if you have the moon in Scorpio or Venus in Scorpio, that doesn't mean like you're screwed forever, or you have this like, dark cloak hanging over you. Although in Scorpio you might have a dark
You sure
cloak.
might.
You sure might. That's a distinct
like
possibility.
it.
I stand
You might
corrected.
learn to love it.
Yeah.
But it means that, in your lifetime, you're going to get to know Venus in the context of a foreign country, or the moon in the context of a foreign country, and learn how to speak a different language. And that will also provide fertile growth for expansion as well.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect analogy. I'll say again. In the ancient times, they use this analogy of temples and rulers of temples, and we use the analogy commonly of hotels and owners. But I think in your example, there is such a perfect opportunity for us to understand, particularly detriment and fall, because those very often in my client practice show up for people as repeating patterns. And so it's almost like you're talking about, hey, 100 times in a row, somebody asked me or said a greeting to me or asked a question in this language I don't understand. But on the 101st time, I was able to answer. It came to me and it came out of my mouth. It's like these repeating patterns that we can actually disrupt, and we have quite a bit of personal agency in doing that. So we're going to talk about that once we get into Venus and the moon, both of whom are a little out of context in Scorpio. But first, I just want to feel into the sign of Scorpio and hear your guys' opinions. What do you think about the sign of Scorpio? How do you feel about Scorpio season when those transits are lighting up your charts? What do we think?
Scorpio, to me, is the courageous realization that there is darkness. It is a thing. And the ability to be present with that, somewhat at home with that, and also understanding the need for degeneration in order for regeneration. Now, I know we talk about death and rebirth all the time. We're probably going to talk about it again today. It just kind of goes with the territory of Scorpio and Pluto. But I think Scorpio, to me, is about deconstructing things down to their very essence. And sometimes that essence isn't like in an air sign, it would more be like a thought. That essence in Scorpio is sometimes a feeling or an intuition or just like the base raw level of something. And the need to get down to that level sometimes in order to feel that we can regenerate something into a more full, enlivened context. So I love Scorpio, and it teaches about the reality of darkness in both its darkness and its dark and its light form. And there are dark and light forms of darkness as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would just elaborate that, Scorpio holds such beauty because of its intensity, right? As this most intense water sign, we have the ability within Scorpio to access a level of depth that is often not present in a lot of other signs in the zodiac. And so there's something when we're talking about the dark of the dark, right? The darkest sign in the wheel of the year. There's something special about Scorpio in which you adapt to sort of seeing in the dark, and your perception then can evolve along with that experience of darkness. And I know through my experience with Scorpio and Pluto in Scorpio that that potential to access a whole other level of depth is really, really prominent. For example, like even something as sort of formative that I think all adults go through in this maturation process is realizing that your own parents are only human too, right? And so, because typically as we grow, we idolize, right, our parents, as we should in a way, right? At least this is my experience. And so this process of growth and depthening helps us see a reality for what it is, right? But also then access a deeper relationship because you have accessed on a whole other level.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. I think tying back into what you were talking about, Whitney, with the Wheel of the Year, when we think of Scorpio, Scorpio is a season in which darkness reigns and darkness is growing. That's why it is a fixed sign. That's stuff that you can learn in Adam's first year course, and he teaches that really eloquently. He also has a masterclass series about temperament, where he talks about archetypal journeys of each of the signs and the rising signs. And so Scorpio's archetypal journeys very often have to do with darkness that begins in an intense way, sustains, builds even sometimes. And I want to make an important distinction here that I don't think we need to make for Scorpios, but I think we need to make for everyone else, which is that darkness does not mean moral darkness. It doesn't mean evil. It doesn't even mean negative situations. There are so many thematic connotations for darkness and nocturnal energy that have nothing to do with morality. So when we talk about darkness, there's just a wide range and a wide spectrum of how that can come out. I think this is kind of a good jumping off point to start talking a little bit about Mars in Scorpio. I just adore Mars in Scorpio people. I love Mars in Scorpio.
Me too.
So sharp, so shrewd. The eyes of a person with Mars in Scorpio just turn me on. They're just like, They can just see through my BS as a Gemini sun. They just see right to the core of me. And those are definitely depth-seeking eyes. People who have dignified planets in Scorpio very, very often say things like, I hate small talk. I wanted to go deeper and nobody else did. Or, I was in a room full of 100 people, but nobody really wanted to go as deep in these conversations with me or connect with me in this deep way. Or they feel like they have depths that are unexplored or sort of spelunked. But I think the Mars in Scorpio, that true Scorpion, it's so sharp and it is so shrewd. I love Mars in Scorpio. What do you think, Alex?
Yes, I have a couple of good friends with Mars and Scorpio, and one of the things I love about them the most is exactly that, is that there is no pretext, there's no pretense, there's just, hey, how you doing? Now I'm going to tell you about this deep, dark thing that happened. I want to understand what it is and get down to the bottom of it. Can you help me do that? And I'm like, yeah, let's do that. Like, we don't have to spend time wasting time on this sort of superficial level, which is nothing wrong with that. It's just the Scorpios. There's an impatience as you start getting towards Sagittarius and Scorpio, that time of year. That's the dark, excuse me, at its height. And there's a feeling often of impending something. We need to figure this out now. There's an urgency that starts to come up. And what I also love about Mars and Scorpio and people who, especially when it's an aspect to the moon or an aspect to the ascendant ruler, or it is the ascendant ruler, is there's this amazing ability to pierce through every layer of anything that's covering up the truth. And so you learn with your friends like that. I learned with my friends like that, hey, guess what, guys? You're not going to get anything by this person. Not that I would want to, but that there's this sense of I see right to the bottom of this, man. Why are we even bothering with this other stuff? And I think also I enjoy the mind of a Mars and Scorpio because it's always the way I kind of think of it is they look like they're on simmer all the time. There's always
those
this
eyes.
Those eyes, right there, they're piercing through. And even sometimes when you're not being intentionally deceptive, you're wait a second, am I saying something? Are they not? Am I? You'll question yourself sometimes, even amidst that intensity. I've had to learn that that's just the intensity. I understand it now. But when I first was especially a friend of mine, I was meeting him first. I was is he staring through to my immortal soul?
Yes.
Yeah, and yes, he is. In fact, he was. Newsflash, he was. So yeah, it's one of my very favorites. But it's intense. It can be very intense. Yeah.
And there's something about those eyes, right? When you say staring through to my immortal soul, right? It's Mars in Scorpio has this ability to sort of pierce the veil, right? As this sign of such depth and intuition and ability to move within the darkness, right? They're able to access like a whole new level that may not be apparent to the rest of us, right? There's like a deeply spiritual component to Scorpio as well because of that. But when I think about Mars in Scorpio, and we're experiencing it now, right? I of course have to consider where Mars is also in dignity, right? In Aries. And so we ask, like, what's the difference, right? What's the difference of Mars in Aries versus Mars in Scorpio? And when I was on my podcast, when I was talking about the recent full moon in Aries, I went into this comparison of our gods Ares and Athena, right? Both gods or goddesses of war, right? But the difference in expression is so potent when you view it in that way, right? Because Mars in Scorpio is more strategic rather than directly aggressive, right? More cunning rather than directly cutting, right? And so I think that's an important distinction to make, right? When we talk about the way Mars moves here, because it's not so overt as it may be in Aries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Rick Levine was on the Astrology podcast talking about Aries, and he used this phrase, ready, fire, aim, for Aries. And that is such an important foil for a Mars in Scorpio, which is not as oriented around the initiation, like the cardinal Aries wants to start the project immediately before they even consider. This Mars in Scorpio is going to see the project through to completion. There is a thoroughness and a precision and a surgical nature to Mars and Scorpio that is more explosive. And I love this distinction that you made, Whitney, between cunning versus cutting. I think when I think about Mars in Aries versus Scorpio, I think about a friend of mine who had basically all of his planets in Scorpio or Aries, almost every single one of them. And he had this process that he had to do once a year of ritualized forgiveness to everyone who had offended him for the entire year. It was called Jubilee. And he would do this process once a year where he would write down everybody's names and just like release all of his resentments and grudges. And I feel like when I think about Scorpio, not even just Mars, any planets in Scorpio, honestly, I think a lot about that resentment and that grudge holding. And I think about ancestry. This gets us into the piece that you were talking about, Whitney, about how Scorpio has this other layer to it. It's not just here in this material realm. There's like an ancestral wisdom happening in Scorpio. And thinking about a feminine fixed water sign, I think about this biological fact that I will surely butcher right now, but you can look it up. And in essence, any woman born carries all of the eggs that she will have. So in these ways, we are still connected to our grandmother, and our granddaughters are still connected to us as women. And, you know, you even think about these biological studies that we're finding where we hold memory in our cells, like our DNA has generational trauma markers in it when you've been a part of a country that has had, you know, political turmoil or things going on. So to me, that is a major entry point into the Scorpio, what I call like it feels like a deep, icy well of ancestral knowledge that's there in Scorpio. And when you have a planet like Mars or Pluto, you just have and any planet in Scorpio, honestly, but you have a special attunement to what's happening beyond, or an ability, you know, that might be part of how detriment plays out, is feeling unable to connect with that or learning how to connect with that over time. Those are some of the ways that I think, and let's feel free to open it up to talk about Pluto as well.
I think these are such amazing points, you guys, and it brings me back to something else I often think about with Mars in Scorpio, which is strategy. Cunning. I like the word cunning, Whitney. I love that word, but the idea of being strategic, that, you know, I'm going to make a plan of how I'm going to act. And oftentimes as a water sign, there's a felt experience to it. There's a psychological experience of like, I'm going to sort of plan this out in my mind first and then execute the plan with a great deal of patience and a great deal of sometimes what would look like restraint, but just like waiting for the right moment, that sense of timing is so important. But I think also when you put Pluto in there, and I know a couple people who have Pluto Mars conjunctions in Scorpio, and it's a party. There is a real feeling of it's not just strategy, but existential intensity. That there's this feeling of like it's all on the line. Everything is very, very high stakes, and Pluto adds to that. But I think Pluto we don't use as ancient astrologers. We don't use Pluto as the ruler of Scorpio, sort of. But I definitely look at it.
But they have it. Let's just make a note about that too, because obviously Mars is the ruler of Scorpio, but Pluto and Scorpio just have undeniable things in common, and I feel more so than the other modern rulers. Like, I don't feel the same hand holding from a Uranus in Aquarius or maybe a Neptune in Pisces, but I think Pluto and Scorpio very clearly shaking hands, have a lot in common.
For sure. I think maybe this, I won't go too far down this road, but I think Neptune and Pisces for sure. Uranus and Aquarius I never got, and I don't believe it, but Pluto and Scorpio coming back. That just adds to the need for, Adam uses the word a lot, catharsis. The catharsis that comes from Scorpio is not always this sense, or Pluto and Scorpio, of like a sort of release of something. It's an understanding or a revelation or a coming to terms with. And I think the base of it is understanding that Scorpio is a sign, Mars in Scorpio, Pluto in Scorpio, at the base of it is actually an exquisite sensitivity. It's a water sign. And I think the way it's get lost in the sort of Scorpio, outer shell of sort of strategy and toughness and, like, don't do me dirty, or I'm going to remember it for the rest of my life. That sort of feeling. The reason that those Scorpio outer shell compensation mechanisms can feel so extreme is because the inner well of Scorpio is actually very, very sensitive. Like when I have clients who have 7th house Scorpio, 7th house ruler, whatever is in Scorpio, when it relates to the relationship aspects of the chart, I'm like, you need to, in a relationship, slowly get to know someone in a way where you can trust them to the ends of the earth and back. Because underneath this sort of protective advanced retreat thing that sometimes goes on with it is this, can I trust you with all of me? This, whatever I feel within me to be so intense, can I trust you to see that and still be there? Because that gets lost with Scorpio sometimes, and all of the outer stuff we talk about is underneath it. They're carrying through that last little ember of light to the winter solstice, and they're desperately trying to protect it. So there's a feeling with both Pluto and Mars, I think, in Scorpio, of this sense of like wanting to really protect that, and sometimes there's an extreme look to how that happens, whether it's psychological or emotional or even physical.
Yes, I love that you bring up the concept of trust and being able to surround, as a Scorpio, being able to surround yourself, right, with people you trust with your whole self. I was in a reading last night with a woman who has her moon in Scorpio. Her Pluto is in Virgo, but she said to me, and I thought this summed it up so well, that I can only let people fully in who are worthy of my depth. And I was like, yes, that is such a Scorpio expression. And of course that's moon, right? And I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but if we talk about how Pluto relates to Scorpio, you are so right, Alex, right? As a water sign, I keep talking about these water signs as intensely creative. And so if we think about not only the destructive powers of Pluto, but the fact that that destruction is meant for massive regeneration, that's what's happening with Scorpio, right? Like that sort of intensity is meant for a regenerative process. I mean, I know I have Pluto and Scorpio square my sun and my rising, right? And there is this process, right, of like my path is constantly being reoriented in order to create the most, right, out of what we're given. And I feel like that's a very Pluto and Scorpio thing, right? Pluto, we talk about as the planet of riches, right? It's not just volcanic ash, you know? Think about how lava is actually the catalyst for major fertilization in beautiful, lush, you know, climates. And so that's how I see Pluto really play in there into the whole, into all the Scorpio dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're alluding to speaks to Venus and how Venus happens to be in detriment in Scorpio as well, because when we think about depth and the scorpionic depth, which is the deepest depth, right? It's not always socially palatable. And that's something that every Scorpio person has to deal with. It is something, you know, I have, as I've mentioned, Pluto conjunct my MC. So that's a thing that has been true about the way that people see me in my life. I have had to negotiate the fact that the kind of depth that sometimes comes out of my mouth or lives in my heart is just not socially normal, and sometimes not palatable. I think that's really important when we think about, you know, this small talk situation or just relational dynamics, kind of relating to Venus and Scorpio, but just generally, you know, somebody asks a Scorpio, "How are you?" They're going to say, "Good." And that's what they're going to say. You know what I mean? And then maybe 25 weeks later, when you ask them what's going on, you're going to get the depth. You're going to get the real story. You know, I had a friend text me recently and say, "I feel like you just opened the vault to national security." And I was like, I don't know. We got there finally. Like it finally happened and we were able to get there. But it's not something that I think you can expect. And there's a process depending on which planets you have in Scorpio and what patterns and what kind of karmic work you have to go through, where I think people who have this depth start out feeling hurt that the world can't meet it or match it or welcome it. And then there's the period that you both kind of mentioned where you get to realize, you know, not everybody gets, this is kind of a gift. Not everybody gets access to this. And I need to defend this depth and the sensitivity of this well and the pH of my spaces and not just let anything in here. And then I think there's also a version of this that becomes power, where you realize like, oh, I'm a magnet for other people with depth, because that is like a true scorpionic charisma that exists depending on what you have going there. Most of the people with those eyes that we're talking about, I'm thinking of James Gandolfini as such a good example. He is a Scorpio rising and he has those eyes, and you would know from across the room if you saw him, like, oh, that's a person with depth behind them. And I have so much more to say about that, but I think it's really interesting to think about how the Scorpio journey can evolve over a lifetime depending on which planets you have there and turn into a real superpower.
Oh, taking us to church, Alexandra. Oh my God. I think it's important too, because, you know, I have a soft spot for the signs. I know we're supposed to love all the signs equally, like our children, and I do. But I have a soft spot for the signs that are often misunderstood, like Virgo and Scorpio, Capricorn, Aquarius, because there's a feeling with Scorpio of like, and actually, let me put it this way. People I've known with Venus and Scorpio particularly actually sometimes look a little more tentative than you would think the signature would look in a chart when you look at it as an astrologer, because they've probably had some experience in their early life particularly of revealing that power in relationship, or revealing something that was shot down, or that was being punished, or was being a big one for Scorpio, shame, right? Was being shamed in some way and taken down, or sometimes even more intense stuff happening around it. So they learn, or the association easily gets made, when I reveal that, it's dangerous. It's when I reveal that, I'm going to be taken down. So as they grow up, they actually become a little bit more timid and can look more surface than you would think a Scorpio would look, because they're like, well, this part of me was totally like you said, I perceive to be unpalatable. But then in the courage that you develop to develop relationships on your terms, to develop relationships with what you need, not necessarily what is like socially acceptable, which, the Venus in Libra might do, right? There's looking for the more social calculation, is looking for, I want an emotional connection that, like I said before, it takes me to the end of the earth and back. I want an emotional connection that is raw and deep. I want something where I can go and bring all of this power, and I can be like, hey, what do you think happens when we die? Tell me. Like that, and just have that conversation, or like, what do you think about, this part of the universe or that part of it, or whatever, because that's where you're going to meet your sense of trust, that like, oh, there are others like me that I can slowly let the guard down. I think that that's something else, just quickly, with Venus and Scorpio too, is being strategic about your trust and being strategic about letting your guard down. Like your client said, Whitney, like some people just don't get access to that space. Some people don't earn their way into your inner keep, and that's okay. They don't all have to do that. But the people you really want in your inner circle, they're all the way in there with you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I feel like what you were getting at a little bit with the sort of experience of shame that Venus and Scorpio can experience, earlier in life, right? With this depth of intensity to, like, it's almost like we think of Mars more as penetrative, right? But Venus in Mars's domicile here, Scorpio, is that incredibly penetrative quality, right? Of like wanting to envelop and be the whole of the sort of romantic experience. But when a Venus in Scorpio may experience sort of the shame of that going wrong earlier in life, I think that's what can result in some of the shadow qualities we see out of Venus in Scorpio, like the tendency to be secretive or almost manipulative, right? Sometimes that tendency, just being really real, right, can be more of that sort of secretive, manipulative quality rather than the timid sort of holding back. It really depends, right, where like Mars is in the chart, of course. But, like we can't blame Venus in Scorpio for those types of experiences that help protect themselves, right? Because at its core, right, yes, we talked about the Scorpion as sharp, but just like the crab, just like Cancer, it has a soft inner goo, right, protected by an outer shell, and that's part of the outer shell that they develop, right? Because like sometimes you've been burned romantically, you know what I mean? Because you might not give back what you give, and there is just, to turn it back toward the positive, like there is nobody who can love deeper, right? And experience that sort of depth, right? When you find those special people who match your depth.
Yes. Say it again for the people in the back. Like the loyalty, the devotion, the unwavering in this lifetime and in every other allegiance of a Venus and Scorpio is truly something special. I mean, really any Scorpio placements. I think what you guys are pointing out is that Venus, as a benefic, wants to say yes to things, friends, connection, love. And in Scorpio, she can't. She can't just mindlessly say yes to everything. She has to stop and consider and be thorough and actually kind of negotiate that. And also, this brings up to me what I think is really interesting about the various planets in Scorpio is their relationship to depth. I feel like Venus in Scorpio has, it's, you can think of all the planets as a pupil dilating around this concept of depth. Also death.
I mean, Mars, death too.
Also death. Mars is like a totally constricted pupil, like just looking for the right thing. Venus is in Scorpio is often just like a dilated pupil, like looking for depth, asking anyone, please give me the depth that I'm craving. It's almost like, oh, look, we see a little cave driving by the side of the road, and that Venus in Scorpio is like, let's go see how deep the cave is and touch the back wall. Like, park the car. Let's get in there right now. We're going to go see how far it goes. And that's how, the benefics can be restricted. We talked about that a little bit with Jupiter and Virgo, how Jupiter kind of wants to say yes, but Virgo is a copy editor nitpicking for every no. Like, Venus, the same thing is kind of happening in Scorpio. But Whitney, yes, a Venus in Scorpio will follow you to the ends of the earth.
And there's nothing wrong with seeking that. I think
No.
that, there's this is where I think the misunderstanding with Scorpio is sometimes too, is like the sort of, there are signs that are perfectly fine with a kind of like a surface relationship, and we do find that's great. But that's not what Scorpio is. That's not what Venus in Scorpio is, especially Venus and Pluto in Scorpio, if you've got that combination. There's I need to exquisitely trust you. And that takes time to develop. And sometimes Venus and Scorpio, something I think about with Venus and Scorpio as a suggestion is like, every little thing that someone does that isn't quite the right thing is not always a slight. And that's one thing Venus and Scorpio can get into, is just like, oh, that's a slight. See, they can't handle me, because there's such a sensitivity there that's being protected, and realizing like you're just slowly advancing forward with your trust. And that might mean you retreat a little bit, and then you need to go forward, and then you retreat. You're just seeing, and you can always work out those patterns in whatever way feels healthiest for you. But I think recognizing that wanting that level of depth and emotional connection in a healthy way is a beautiful thing, and there's nothing wrong with it. But it, like we're saying, and I think this happens with planets in detriment a lot, you often start out in your earlier life with the opposite, and you learn, there's something you learn around it, some sort of shaming or guilting you learn around it that has to be, as you grow older, undone in some way.
And doesn't that just prove the beauty of the evolution of karma, right? Like, yeah. That's what I love about the birth chart, and the whole idea that nothing is good or bad, right? Just like we said, we're not attaching any sort of morality to the term darkness, right? Because that can function in such different, beautiful, multivalent ways depending on how our experiences lead us through life.
You're muted.
You're muted.
I think this is a great time
you
to
pulled
bring
a Whitney.
I did. I am Whitney Kranz.
You are. It's working, guys.
It is, yeah. No, I think this is a good time to bring up the moon in Scorpio, and this is where, we might piss off some Scorpios, but I don't think Scorpios need us to say these things, right? Like,
they don't need to be coddled either.
No. All this, anyone with Scorpio placements, like, we know, we were just talking about this, and I have my Pluto MC, and I was just writing the other day how much I love being told that I'm too intense or that I'm too much. I just adore that. To me, it feels like a compliment at this point in my life. Of course, when I was younger, it did not feel like a compliment, and that's what we're talking about. And it was always like, oh, I'm sorry, whatever. We don't go back to that time period. Now I love this. I love being told that they used to call me Scary Blairy in the corporate world because I was scary. Because I was scary and mean, but now I'm a sweetie. But the moon in Scorpio is a truly special case, and here's why. The moon is in its fall in Scorpio, which is different than being in detriment. So Venus in detriment is like Venus is being hosted by Mars. Mars and Venus are opposites or sexy lovers, whatever you want to envision them as. But Venus is out of her element. Now, in ancient astrology, the moon governed the realm of fortune. And as we know, the moon is the only sort of traditional body that we track that orbits the earth. All of these other things that we track orbit the sun, are the sun. And the moon actually governs this system of changing circumstances and fortune and the tides in our primarily water-made bodies here on Earth. So I do think that the moon in Scorpio, it's important to note, to validate people's life experiences, that this can be a tough placement. Like, no placement is a doom or death sentence. We've always said that, and I believe that especially about the moon in Scorpio. But there's no way around it without acknowledging that people who have the moon in Scorpio do sometimes experience what we could colloquially agree on as bad luck, or circumstances that don't work out in their favor, or difficult life experiences that are explained with that moon in Scorpio. And I find this to be especially true for my clients who also have Pluto in Scorpio. We were joking before the show as well that, like, if you have Pluto in Libra or Virgo, with the moon in Scorpio, you've still been through the Pluto moon transit. So if you are a younger listener and you have Pluto in Sagittarius, like my clients with Pluto and Sagittarius with Scorpio moons are just sweetie pies. They're sweet. They've never felt that moon Pluto. They don't know what that's about. My clients who have moon Pluto in Scorpio, they have had some difficult life experiences, and this can be a long ongoing karmic path of understanding what the moon in Scorpio means, because a lot of times the events that come about in relation to that moon feel senseless. It's like, why me? Why did this happen to me? And those events are so destabilizing to also our faith, which I think has something to do kind of with the moon here. But I wonder what you guys think about the moon being in its fall in the sign of Scorpio.
I think what you're speaking to here, Alexandra, is so important, because I'm trying to order my thoughts around this to get them correct. But the moon represents, as the ruler of Cancer, the fundamental principles of safe nurturance. Mm-hmm. That's basically what the moon represents. The moon in Scorpio acknowledges, this doesn't always show up in the birth chart of the native, in the life of the native, but it can, that even in those places where we should be the safest, where we should be cared for, sometimes we're neglected. Sometimes we're not cared for. And sometimes, in the darkest sense of Scorpio, heinous, horrible, dominating, violating things happen in those spaces too. And one of the things that I've noted, I cannot count how many therapists I've had in my practice who specialize in trauma who have the moon in Scorpio.
Yes.
I cannot count by now. I've lost count. It is, it's not saying you were supposed to go through anything tough. You were supposed to go through that, or it was right, or it was okay. It's saying that when you go through that, sometimes there is an impetus with Scorpio to want to right a wrong, to want to help someone else who's been through that, to nurture someone who has not, nurture someone through an experience that has felt unnurturing, or help them through a violation, or help them through a feeling of being dominated, or whatever it happened. But this, that also brings me to another aspect of Scorpio, and I think this plays into the moon particularly too in this sense, is that in the ancient zodiac, Libra was part of Scorpio. And there's a sense, and we've talked about this, I think, in a couple of episodes, about how Virgo, Libra, and Scorpio all have a sense of justice to them. And there's a sense with, when those early things happen, especially with the moon, it can often indicate stuff that's happened in childhood or in their early family. There can be sometimes this impetus to be like, I want to make sure no one else goes through that. I want to protect them. I want to strategically form sort of a barrier of nurturance around them in some way. And the other thing that Scorpio moons have too, and this doesn't mean you don't necessarily have had to go through anything super tough to have this, because Scorpio moons, I think, have this innately, is the ability to be with people when they're in very, very intense situations. Yes. Scorpios really feel, I think, at home in the intensity. They're not fazed by somebody else's darkness. And I know from doing all the trauma-informed coachings that I've done and taught over the years, one of the last things you want to do when someone's revealing something really tough to you is start doing poor you, or pushing back on them and saying, because then they have to take care of you and they feel like they're dropping something on you. You have to be able to hold your sense of neutrality and be okay with them in their space, to hold space for that. And Scorpio moons, chef's kiss to be able to do it.
Right. Yes. I mean, talk about the grace that Scorpio moon has in handling these deep, dark, intense energies and topics, right? I can't tell you how many Scorpio moons I've met who have this natural affinity toward, yes, therapy, but intensely, grief work, right? Working with grief to help people move through their deepest, darkest moments and feelings in this way of sort of transmutation of that deep energy and circumstance, right? And it's so funny, because I feel like there's something so well known about Scorpio moons that's they're just really, or maybe Scorpios in general, fascinated by death. drawn to working in places, yes, like grief work, of course, but like mortuary science and that kind of thing, right? It's like this comfort, this feeling of being able to maintain comfortability in this place where so many other people just won't tread, right? It's uncanny, really.
Totally. I think you're speaking to also this dilation thing that I was talking about earlier. And I feel like with a Scorpio moon around the mother and the nurturing, there is a wounding. And so there's often this incoherent, dissonant, dual need, which is to protect. As soon as somebody starts getting interested in the Scorpio moon, they're like, I need to protect myself from that interest because it hurt me in the past. But at the same time, there's such a hunger for that interest in them. And it's such an interesting duality when we talk with Scorpio moons. My friends and my clients who have Scorpio moons desperately want to be known and want people to care enough to ask. But they are also fundamentally skeptical of any genuine interest that's kind of shown in them. And again, rightfully so in many life experiences of Scorpio moons. It reminds me of this Taylor Swift lyric. She has Mars in Scorpio, but there's a line in the song Who's Afraid of Little Old Me where she says, they tell me everything is not about me, but what if it is? And that's the experience I think of the Scorpio moon sometimes is like, well, bad luck kind of just seems to follow me. And then your friend will go, oh, it's not that bad. Like what you've been through. No, but it is. What if it is? Because actually I've been through some things. And so I think that brings up a really interesting book I was reading recently that I just want to throw out there for Scorpio moons, or anyone with Pluto in Scorpio I think would be interested as well. It's called Mother Hunger. And it's a book about the ways that our bodies as infants, 3 years old and less, develop implicit memory. So explicit memory is memory we can access consciously. Implicit is more of our nervous system, imprint, cellular memory, things that our body is storing for us that our brain can't necessarily access on demand. And basically, the science of recent times has shown us that our entire nervous system for our entire adult life is defined by the quality of the attention and presence we were receiving from specifically our mother in the first 1,000 days of life. So if your mother was not present with you, and I don't mean physical presence, I mean this kind, the juicy kind, spiritually present with you, your nervous system is a reflection. Your nervous system today, pending all the work we do, in psychology and therapy, but your nervous system is a reflection of the mothering that you received at that time. And it can result in this inappropriate expression where we have these urges, this hunger in our life that goes in other pockets of our life because we didn't have this one thing. So we can get hungry for food, and overeating can be related to mothering. We also have things like sex and alcohol and drugs and interpersonal relationships, this hunger that is sort of plutonic, volcanic. It was suppressed in us, and then it becomes this like inappropriate roaring thing that explodes out of us in different ways. So I think that book could be an interesting reference point for Scorpio moon, and also anyone who relates to that topic. Definitely go check out that book.
Wow. I mean, like, this is such a rich conversation in the sense that it's such a Scorpio conversation because we're getting to the root of it. That's what Scorpios do. We're getting to, a lot of times that's what Scorpios are looking for is why is this here? Like there's a desire that you're speaking to, Alexandra, that's like, I have this desire and I don't know where that came from or how it affects me. And it can be early life, it can be the way your mom interacts. And sometimes I remember I was at the trauma conference downtown a couple of years ago, and I can't remember the psychologist who did this experiment, so forgive me guys. If you know, you can put it in the comments. But they're called the blank face experiments. And
yes, she talks about it in the book. Yeah.
Yeah,
incredible.
It was
Please continue,
really fascinating. Yeah, so basically what they show is like a mother with an infant. I think the infant was about 4 to 5 months old, and they showed a mother interacting with the infant and following the infant and following how it moves and interacting, so kind of mirroring back what the infant is feeling. And then they showed a couple of examples where that didn't happen. And a couple of them were because the mother was experiencing a bout of depression or mental illness. Mm-hmm. It was not her fault. It was nothing. It was just the circumstances surrounding that birth, right? And What he showed later on, which was really interesting, was a sample of couples therapy where there was a man, it was a man and a woman. The man happened to be shutting down, and the woman's like, "Are you just going to shut down? Are you just going to shut down? Are you just going to shut down?" And he's just shutting down more and more and more and more. And he showed how that was emulating the same type of interaction was happening between the mother and the infant. And so all that to say, Scorpio moons in some way can hold space for those complexities. They can hold space for, sometimes it does, much of the time, God knows all our childhoods don't go off without a hitch. And sometimes there's stuff that goes slightly wrong. Sometimes there's stuff that goes really wrong. And the ability to hold space for that without platitude and without pushing back somebody's experience of it, like it wasn't that bad, or you're lucky to have all this, and really honoring the space that they might feel within themselves is like chef's kiss for a Scorpio moon. It's exactly what that moon is made for. So it's like, also to say too that like even if you hadn't experienced those things yourself, you might be the person that people just come up to and start dumping all their stuff in your lap. You're just like, I'm just walking down. I've said this to Scorpio moon clients. I'm like, are you the person that people will just come up to? They've met you for 5 minutes, and all of a sudden their deepest, darkest trauma. They're like, yeah, I don't know why it just keeps happening. That's the Scorpio moon presence. They can hold that. Yeah.
I texted our astrologer group chat the other day, but I was like, on average, how many I'm on the brink of something incredibly traumatic and dramatic emails do you guys get a month? Because with my Pluto MC, it's like I get a pretty high average of those emails a month. Like I got to send hotlines to people. It's just like people seek me out for that. Yeah. That's what it is.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and there's a capacity there then, obviously, in your work as an astrologer to hold those hard experiences for others, right? And I think this brings up a really important piece of theory that really applies here because, oftentimes, basically every planet in the zodiac that has a planet in fall, like the moon is in fall in Scorpio, also has an exaltation, but there is no planet exalted in Scorpio. And there's a really important reason why, and it goes back to this whole idea of, exaltation being tied itself to the moon and lunar qualities. But the interesting thing is that with Scorpio and Taurus, right, as the dyad, right, being the outliers of these planets that just have one or the other, it is all made sense by the ancient astrologer Rhetorius, who said, and I am going to read the quote word for word because I think it's really important, but basically, where the moon, the ruler of fortune itself, is in fall, no other planet may be exalted. How could there be fortune where fortune herself is depressed? And so, yes, Rhetorius says, and again, why is it that the place where the moon is exalted, there nothing is depressed, and where the moon is depressed, there nothing is exalted? We say that is because the moon is the fortune of all, and he whom fortune exalts, no one may depress, while he whom fortune depresses, no one is able to exalt. And I think that brings like a really firm foundation to what we're talking about here, right? The most beautiful thing about practicing Hellenistic ancient astrology is that we have all of these teachings that help guide us in theory to all of these delineations we're talking about today. Everything we've said really can be based on this fact. And, just a casual plug for year one, like I had this in my mind as I was preparing for this episode, and I went back to the course so I could pull the actual quote, right? Because I think it's so powerfully evocative about what we're dealing with here with Scorpio.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I'm so glad that you brought that quote in, because that's kind of why we led in the preamble about the Scorpio moon section about the nature of certain life experiences for a Scorpio moon that may genuinely feel unlucky or may genuinely feel like circumstances that were completely outside of your control And the perfect Taylor Swift lyric, what if it is actually all about me? What if it actually was bad luck? What if I actually, I get a lot of Scorpio moon clients who are like, am I just going to have bad luck for the rest of my life? The answer is absolutely no. But having that awareness can go a long way in terms of how you can not just change your perception, therefore your reality, but even using remediation spiritually in a wide range of ways to address something like a fallen moon. I was thinking recently, even Sphere and Sundry put out an elected collection with the moon in Scorpio. So when clients come to me and they're like, am I doomed with a Scorpio moon? Not unless Austin Kopek's a bad astrologer, because there are conditions in which we want a Scorpio moon. Like not unless people stop needing grief counselors or stop wanting to talk deeply about their feelings and emotions. Just there's like a point, I think, in any Scorpio placement's life where you get to decide, this is actually something I need to protect, my intensity and my depth. And then there's like a next level that I can see myself getting into, which is like, oh, this is power actually. And my people will always find me. My people see me, they know immediately, like the James Gandolfini effect and the shrewd eyes. So wrapping us up a little bit about just all of these, planets. We've talked about Mars, we've talked about Pluto, we've talked about Venus and the moon, and we've talked about Scorpio generally. What kind of closing thoughts or things would you like to add, Alex?
I think in general that we've talked about some heavy stuff today. This is Scorpio deals with heavy stuff. That just to echo what you guys are saying is that like this does not mean you're screwed. It doesn't mean you're in the example I was giving before, the blank face experience. So these kids who the mother sits and she's not interacting with the kid, right? So the kid starts to try to get her attention, and then they show how this advances in adult life. It might show up in a relationship, and those are things that can be addressed. That was the whole point of like this guy wasn't giving a talk saying like, hey, you're screwed for life. It's saying this may have been an experience that was happening in early life or experience that happened in life, but there are things that can be done when the space is held appropriately and you rebuild that trust slowly. Because fundamentally what's ruptured, what I perceived, again, I'm just speaking from armchair psychology here, but like there's a rupture of trust. There's a rupture of I can't trust that you're there with me. And that can slowly be rebuilt. And sometimes that's the process. So what I want to say also is, and I want to say this to every sign, there's nothing wrong with you. There's just nothing wrong with you. And I think Scorpios really need to hear like his shame, that fundamental belief that I am wrong, I am bad. There is nothing wrong with you. There is always a way to work with what you have, and you can always find your people. You just need different peeps sometimes. And yes, like Alexandra was saying, it's not always socially palatable. Like Wednesday Addams. I love Wednesday Addams. She's the best.
Who doesn't?
I love Addams, right? She's not playing by anybody else's rules. She's Wednesday Addams. She's doing her thing, right? And she finds her people. So yeah, I would just say like there's nothing wrong with you, and don't carry that belief around any longer than you have to.
Right. We love Wednesday Addams because she is so authentically herself and doesn't give a fuck if you don't jive with that, right? And I think that's the message here. I really cannot say a whole lot more than how you just closed us out, Alex, except that, like, the message is that Scorpio, no matter your experience, you are worthy, right? And you must find people who are worthy of your depth and presence and intensity, right? And because there is just so much richness, like Pluto, there at the core of who you are.
Yeah, I think I want to even yes and that and say not only is there nothing wrong with you, but there are other freaks in the world who love your intensity. Like, some of us love to have those conversations and to speak about intensity. I think most astrologers have something like that in them, right? Mm-hmm. Three of us certainly. But, there are other people in the world who are also sitting there having surface level conversations thinking this is actually hell on earth. I had a client with some Scorpio placements once talk about going to an event, and she was saying, there's 30 people here, and I've only found 3 people I can truly be myself around. And I was like, that is an astronomical number of people. 3 out of 30
10%.
Incredible success
That's
rate
great.
for somebody to find people who you can truly be yourself around. And to Alex's point, yeah, if your first 1,000 days were messed up and you have that mother hunger that we were talking about, maybe you do have a dysregulated nervous system. That's something you can fix. You can work on in this lifetime. There are ways that you can work on that. Regulate that central nervous system. Protect your spiritual pH. Yeah, maybe you let people in who didn't deserve to. That's also fixable. You can learn these things and, learn to set healthy boundaries. And you have the power of Mars on your side, ready to cut everybody out at a moment's notice, the moment you realize that those are not the right people. So just to yes and everything you two are saying, not only is there nothing wrong with you, you have a superpower. You have a true power in this culture that is very surface level. I think about my son, he was born with the Sun and Mars conjunct in Scorpio, conjunct my MC Pluto. So we have an interesting little scorpionic relationship, and he's not even 2 yet, but the surgical nature of watching this boy organize crayons, they're all facing the exact same way, and he moves them from one container to the other container and then back to the original for hours. He is riveted by this activity, a toddler. That is the power of Scorpio, and it is such a, I think, truly superpower. So it's been a real pleasure to talk about this with you guys today. I love talking about scorpionic depth. I know my colleagues do too. Why don't we go around and tell everybody where they can find us if they want to talk about ancestral grieving, trauma, curses placed on your ancestors by spooky witches. Where can they find you, Alex?
It's my literal favorite thing. Let's talk all about it. Oh my God. Because we can do something about it. That's because we can do something about it. This is a lot of what I do with energy work. Actually, is very much like that. You can find me at www.alexamorosi.com. You can book readings with me there. You can book my kitchen sink reading, which is basically I just get out everything and we do a reading. I get the chart out, I get the cards out, I get my intuition out, do some energy work. We do it all. That's become by far and away my most popular form of reading. You can also find me on Substack at The Subtle Universe. I have a free level subscription, a couple of paid level subscriptions. And the free level subscription, you get a new and full moon newsletter every month. The paid subscription, there's some other perks and benefits which you can find there, and that's where you can find me.
Amazing. And if you want to book a spooky ancestral depth reading with yours truly, head over to astroarcana.com and book a reading there. You can also tune in to my podcast, House of Good Spirit, here on YouTube at astro.arcana.astrology. And at that same handle, find me on Instagram so we can connect.
Beautiful. If you guys want to send me an email from the brink or tell me that I'm too intense, you can do so at my website, the number 9livesastrology.com. I'm also the number 9 Lives Astrology on YouTube. I do weekly transits. I also have some fun, cool videos out on Fridays. I got a Who's Your Time Lord video that came out. I've got an Astro Weirdos episode on the docket as well. And you can find me on Instagram. I post all kinds of random stuff there. It's been such a pleasure talking about Scorpio, dipping our canteen into the scorpionic ancestral well with you guys. Adore you. Everybody have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Happy weekend.